This video is brought to you by Straight Goods News, Canada's alternative online news source. Visit straightgoods.ca.
And the results are typically Canadian. Do you agree or disagree that governments in Canada should actively find ways to reduce the gap between wealthy people and everybody else? 82% agreed. 52% said strongly agree. And that's a fairly hefty number for these kinds of questions. So in principle, I think that perhaps not consensus, but a strong view, maybe unlike the U.S., that government has an important role to play.
Let's say what's going on in London, Ontario now, where there's a lockout at a company that used to be General Motors, and then it was owned by Caterpillar, but it's called something else altogether. And apparently the lockout is there because the people working there don't want to take a 50% pay cut. And you can kind of understand, even if you thought you were overpaid, you wouldn't want to do that. But is this what is happening to those kind of jobs, and people are going to work for a lot less money, which means that they and their families, they may not fall into complete poverty, but they fall into almost the working poor.
Exactly, and that really speaks to the need for a strong redistributive system in the country. And I have to say, I was concerned about the OECD conclusion that these programs have become less effective, and it's true. I absolutely agree, and we have to ask why. First of all, I think because of the problems that you've identified in terms of technology and globalization, the fact that they are trying to compensate for a far more difficult and unstable labor market. But the problem of ensuring that people actually are able to receive an income paid by government has really declined. We've let those programs languish. We have some very, very powerful instruments in Canada that we've developed over the years, and I think we've neglected them. And I think that's what your figures were showing. We have neglected the fact that, for example, we have a Canada Child Tax Benefit that pays benefits to 90% of Canadian families, more to lower income families and modest income families. And up until about between, I guess, 1998 and 2007, there had been progressive increases to that benefit. We were moving up and moving in the right direction and lowering inequality. The problem was that in 2008 we stopped doing that. Two new programs were introduced which effectively were conferring benefits on higher income families. And also really did nothing to address some of the fundamental problems related to a childcare system. I'm referring to the universal childcare benefit and the non-refundable child tax credit. These were new programs, but they were actually retreads of older programs. And so we have $3.5 billion, for example, being invested in programs that are going primarily toward higher income Canadians that are not meeting childcare needs that they're supposedly, intended to do. We could have used that $3.5 billion for $4 billion was what we had calculated increase to have an adequate child benefit in the area of about $5,000 per child for the first child. So all I'm saying is your question speaks very powerfully, I think, to the fact that we need to pay attention to the adequacy of the programs we have. They are very powerful levers, and we've let them go. We need to reinvest and make sure that we're not redirecting those funds to the families that need it.
And I guess I always thought earnings inequality was linked to the declining bargaining power of workers, and that was linked in part to offshoring, the possibility of taking well-paid manufacturing jobs in North America and producing those goods cheaply in Asia or some other parts of the world.
People who are really skilled and really smart are making a lot more money than people who don't have those skills and don't have that education. And something that does come through in the data, which is a difference between today's super elite and the Gilded Age super elite, with whom they are very often compared, is, as Alessandro also said in a sort of passing line, that this is mostly working income, right? So this is not people, John Stuart Mill had this line about the Duke of Bedford getting rich in his sleep and how that was intolerable. But actually, the 1% and the 0.1%, they work really hard. If you look at in the US, the hours worked are greater than people lower down the distribution, and it tends to be people who are, really well educated. So I think that complicates things a great deal, and that's why I think actually these points that Sherri and Mark were making, particularly about social cohesion, are essential. And why I'm a little bit worried about the United States, because if you don't have buy-in from the 1%, if you don't have the 1% saying, yeah, actually, I'm willing to pay higher taxes because I prefer to live in a community. I prefer actually to have really good public schools so my kids can go to public schools rather than having to send them to private schools. I prefer to pay higher taxes and have a good healthcare system that everybody partakes of. You know, I think without that, actually it becomes really difficult.
To both talk about the importance and the power of a redistributive system, both in terms of income security programs and a progressive income tax system. What I probably would have added to this paper, how you allowed me more words, would have been the fact that, you know, we've written over the past 20 years at Caledon about the importance of looking at a broad range of strategies, of linked strategies together. It's not just income redistribution. Obviously, that's crucial, and that's where we focus our, you know, our attention in this particular paper. But investment in early childhood development, in basic education, particularly for the Aboriginal population in our country, where we have about, you know, a non-completion rate of about, you know, 60% in terms of First Nations ages 20 to 24 living on reserve, a very, very low high school completion rate. And our colleague Michael Mendelsohn has recommended, for example, a First Nations Education Act. We've also written extensively about community projects involving municipal governments, at all levels of government, the private sector, and looking at paying living wages so that employers are actually starting to pay living wages rather than always, you know, compensating after the fact. And finally, there's been a whole body of literature that we put forward on investing in social infrastructure in terms of public schools and, you know, playgrounds and community places, and not simply through the tax measures where we're allowing individuals or individual households to claim certain benefits, but that we have money for investing in the infrastructure that makes life good for everybody.
Sort of, you know, I get lots of economic analysis newsletters, and one of them then suggested, it's also a guy I really like, Ed Yardeni, smart analyst, does a great daily note. And right after Obama did his big income inequality speech in December in Kansas, Yardeni's reaction was, that was the same day that this new planet had been discovered, and his reaction was, you know the answer, right? It was, here he goes, we may need an escape plan if Europe blows up and if President Barack Obama spends the next 11 months campaigning rather than presiding. Just in the nick of time, NASA yesterday announced that its Kepler Space Telescope has found a new planet, Kepler 22b. It is the most Earth-like yet. Those of us who favor fiscal discipline, small governments, and low taxes might consider moving there and starting over.
Which is that is the quality of the jobs that is lacking. There has been policies that have created incentives to become more employed, but and that have, in the end of the day, produced more jobs, but low quality jobs. So the issue now is how to move into better quality jobs.
And what frightens me is that maybe we're not seeing economic malfunction, maybe we're seeing a very positive overall in aggregate economic transformation that has very severe downsides. And managing that is going to be really hard because there is a group of winners that isn't going to see the downsides as much because it can't. If you're the winner, it's hard to see the downside. And a very powerful solution, I think, to this disparity, to these two worlds, is if you maintain a public space that everyone partakes in, which is not a market-driven space. And what I feel so strongly, living in Manhattan, coming back to Canada, right, and I grew up in a town in northern Alberta, is the disparity. It's not so much one in income, in paychecks. It's that the U.S. super elite lives in a completely different world. If you're flying in a private jet, sending your kids to private schools, using private medical care, you have almost no contact with the lived reality of a huge part of the population. And to me, what's frightening is what that does to the whole political dynamic, because I think we're maybe going to be living with these economic forces
I
for
think
30
the hair
years.
tax would be a good idea. The United States has one. Why don't we have one? Sir, however, I don't think it would take in a lot of money. I agree completely, we should be raising the GST. We never should have decreased the GST from 7% to 5%. If we hadn't done that, we would have no deficit, basically. It would be almost nothing in terms of...
$12 billion a year.
Right. But anyway, that's another issue.
Thanks.
I want to give Mark a turn on that, because it is a political issue as well. And well, economically, I would think Andrew makes good sense. The GST is the most regressive tax possible, and impacts the raise on it impacts poor people unless you're really poor and get a rebate. So, and it impacts it more than it does wealthy people, I would think.
In fact,
But you answer it, Mark, not me.
cutting the GST was actually mildly progressive, because we cut the GST, which everyone pays, but we maintained the credits, which were based on a 7% calculation at their existing level. So the net effect of the GST cut was slightly progressive, but it did lead to lower government revenues overall. It was a politically extremely popular tax cut, and no political party of any stripe, federally or provincially, despite the tax room being created, has stepped in to fill that gap. So that's really the issue, is do you want to pay every time you buy anything more consumption taxes? But that is the way ultimately to raise large amounts of revenue to support the kinds of programs that a lot of people would like to see. So that's taxing the 1% won't get you there.